This is Curious Minnesota, a Star Tribune project that sends staff from the state's largest newsroom hunting for the answers to great questions we receive from you, our readers. We're here to answer everything you want to know about the state's people, places, and culture.
Welcome to Curious Minnesota. I'm your host, Eric Roper. I am guessing that many of our listeners have childhood memories about the topic of today's show, Tonka toys. These heavy-duty toy trucks have been an enduring part of the children's toy market for generations, known for their realistic appearance and metal construction. Tonka trucks are still sold today by Hasbro more than 70 years after they were invented in the western Twin Cities suburbs. A reader wanted to know how Tonka toys got its start in the suburb of Mound, and joining me today is reporter Nick Williams, who wrote a story on the topic for Curious Minnesota. Well, Nick, thanks so much for joining us today. So, Tonka trucks. Before we get into the history, what is the selling point of a Tonka truck versus other toy trucks? Why is this such a persistent, enduring brand? What's their thing that makes them different?
So, in talking to a curator from The Strong, who runs the National Museum of Play and National Toy Hall of Fame, is that Tonka was just embedded in realism.
Okay.
They mimic the real life-like machinery down to the T. Mm-hmm. And that's what set them apart from everybody. It wasn't fantastical. It wasn't, very animated. It was a miniature version of what you see every day in the real world.
Set the scene for us as far as toy trends in the 40s. What are kids looking to play with in the 40s? Or what are they not looking to play with? What are sort of the shifting moods of the toy market back then?
So shifting away from wood toys, so the wooden bat, the wooden boats, mm-hmm. dolls, marbles were created decades before that, right. But they're starting to get boring a little bit. So kids are wanting something more hands-on to play with, a little more real, and we haven't gotten into space toys yet and robots. So We're in this period between the 40s and the 70s of this period, maybe 20 years, where marbles are fading out, wood toys are fading out, space toys aren't here yet. Mm-hmm. What's in the middle? Metal trucks.
Okay. Real stuff.
Real, but there's no WWE yet. There's no wrestling toy. Yeah.
Which is what toys became very fantastical later on.
Correct.
These were not fantastical toys or science fiction type toys.
No.
Or wrestling, as you mentioned.
Yeah. There's a sweet spot in the era of the toy industry that Tonka found.
So this whole story we know it starts in the western suburbs, but it doesn't start as a toy company. So what's going on? Where does this all begin?
So the story begins in 1946. Three men start a company called Mound Metalcraft, where they make metal tie racks and gardening tools.
And so they're doing this in Mound. They just open up a factory or something? Or
Not yet. So they move into a former schoolhouse that was used to make ammunition boxes during World War II. So
it's like a retrofitted factory into this old schoolhouse.
Correct.
And we don't need a lot of ammunition boxes anymore, but we need
office space, we need production space.
Right, okay. And so how do they get into the toy business?
So there's also another Minnesota company called Streeter Industries. Mm-hmm. At the time, they later known for their retail display shelving, but Streeter comes out with the design of a steam shovel and a crane.
Okay.
And together with Mound Metalcraft, they put out some of these designs of these toys. Now, Mound Metalcraft sees an opportunity in this because these toys are selling faster than their gardening tools and metal tie racks.
Yeah.
So they abandon that whole business model altogether.
Yeah.
And move forward with the toy making.
And I love in the story you mentioned that they're basically using kind of recycled parts to put these things together.
Recycled meat cans. You think about that, and then parts of the old ammunition boxes.
Okay.
It kind of gives you this idea of okay, we're going to move forward with this, but we're going to use what we have. We're not going to put all these resources into it right away. Mm-hmm. We're going to see if we have a good product. We use the weekend at a low cost, and boom, we have a product that works. Now let's start making them and expanding.
Yeah.
That.
Okay, so the company that we know, the name we know, gets created in 48. Where do they come up with, I mean, this is a dumb question. Where do they come up with Tonka? Where did that name come up with?
Based on Lake Minnetonka,
okay,
which is right there in Mound. So it was right there, just inspired by their own surroundings.
Wow. Okay. So then they formed the company, Tonka Toys. You know, there's so many toy companies. I don't know about back then. I'm sure there were lots of toy companies back then. They're a small firm. We know they broke through. We know that they were successful. What was their pitch to, I mean, a lot of this is about marketing, right? So what's their pitch to sort of get successful? How do they kind of reach beyond the noise?
Their lane was pitching to young boys this masculine, durable toy that reflects this macho industry of construction.
Okay.
For boys, I think the jingle was for boys who want lifelike toys that they can use too.
Right.
So their image or their idea was boys walking down the street, they see a digger, they see a crane, they see a steam shovel. They want to play with that huge machine. They can buy a miniature version of it.
Right. And there's an ad that we embedded on the story, and people should go take a look at it. But it literally kind of shows these kids in a sandbox, and they're kind of like constructing stuff. And they're, I mean, what you sort of get the sense of why these trucks are unique, and that they can flip a sort of a lever, and then the dump truck and stuff kind of actually dumps everything. I mean, this stuff actually seems to work. Like you could actually move earth or sand with it.
Correct. You can dump work over here. You could shout out, hey, dump that over there, like you're on the work site, right? You can pick up a little batch of dirt in the sand lot and dump it over here and construct something with your own hands. Right.
So were a lot of companies manufacturing metal toy trucks?
Not at this level and not at this scale.
Okay.
I think by 1955, they had invested in their own production facility in Mound and around Mound, and they were producing at a rate that no other company was at this time.
Okay, and this is being basically locally manufactured.
Minnesota made.
Okay. So you mentioned in the story that between 1952 and 1961, all the founders leave, which is sort of a troubling side. It could be if you were just to tell someone that on face value. What's going on? Why did these people take off? I mean, it was for different reasons.
For different reasons. So another state offered the founders money, tax incentives, try to persuade them to move Tonka Toys to their state. I believe it was Tennessee. And the board voted that down. And two of the founders disagreed with that so much that they left the company.
Wow.
And years later, a third founder left because of health reasons. And he was, I believe his name was Lynn, and he was the one who was a former automobile salesman in Minneapolis.
Okay.
And he's in some of the, when they started getting big, was kind of like the spokesperson, but he left later.
You might hear that and think, that's kind of the end of the story. But it actually is kind of the beginning of Tonka becoming a big brand. So they really start expanding in the 60s, right? Correct.
Acquisitions. They partner with a distributor that makes them go nationwide with their sales. They're acquiring, I believe it's a grill company. They're kind of trying to take over the metal business to consumer industry, trying to own that. And then they're just expanding. They're hiring more. They're becoming a bigger company.
Right. Again, we talk about people sort of what they think about when they think of a Tonka truck. It's around this time that they create what becomes their signature truck. So what is that?
That is the Mighty Tonka dump truck. I think 1965 is when it first came
Describe this for us. What are, because people might be picturing something. What is this thing?
So if you could picture a 9-pound, 10-pound metal dump truck with like 4.5-inch rubber tires.
Yeah. It looks a bit like those trucks on the Iron Range that take all the material from the excavators, like those big, they're just like oversized dump trucks, essentially. It's yellow.
Yellow, black stripes. You could lift that bay to dump the dirt,
it actually
sand.
dumped.
It actually dumped, whatever was inside of it. And I think one of their most famous early commercials, once, color TVs came out, was that elephant who they had put its foot on the back of that trunk and put its weight on it, and that it didn't break.
Oh, okay. So they're really, again, sort of back to what we began with. I mean, the sort of solid nature of this is a big selling point because they're a bit more, expensive than normal toys?
They are more expensive, and that's what their selling point. It's more durable. Most toys would break within the first couple of weeks.
Yeah.
But this toy could last years.
Right.
And that's why parents were willing to invest in it, because they knew they had a toy for their child that was going to last for a long time.
Right, because kids, who knows what they're going to do with these things, and they're going to, I mean, we'll get to what some of the people in the comments told us what they were doing with them. Normal toys might break down from some of that activity. So, okay, the dump truck comes out. Again, this is being locally manufactured, but then by the 80s, so that's 65 or so, the dump truck comes out, but then by the 80s, now we're talking about moving some of this manufacturing out of Minnesota. So what happens there?
Right. They opened a facility in Juarez, Mexico. They had another facility in Texas. And I'm just going to speculate, cheaper labor costs to move it down there. And they start to wind down their Minnesota facility by 83.
Okay. And then this is now part of Hasbro. So when did that all happen?
1991, Hasbro officially acquires Tonka Toys.
Meaning
Tonka
it has basically no more Minnesota elements to it.
In terms of production or an office here, correct. That's all moved, I believe, to Hasbro's Rhode Island headquarters now.
Yeah.
So
this story, I mean, it kind of struck a chord with people. If you think about the era we're talking about, 50s, 60s, 70s, a lot of people alive today would have been kids around that time. What were some of the feedback that you received from people?
That they remember going on field trips to the old Tonka Toys factory.
That sounds like an exciting field trip.
Yeah, I mean...
We actually have a picture of one of those on the story, but yeah.
Right, and you go there and you see the assembly line, you see how these toys are made, people playing with them in the sandbox or in a schoolyard.
There were some people, it was either on Facebook or somewhere else, that talked about literally riding on top of these things going down a driveway, which if you think about that elephant ad, they're really, that's the kind of abuse that you'd have to have a serious toy to handle that kind of thing.
Right. I think skateboards maybe are run by this time in the 70s, but for those who didn't have a skateboard or a scooter,
right,
and you weren't big enough to have a two-wheel bike, maybe this was your ride of choice, your adventure,
right,
extreme sport for something to play in the driveway with.
Yeah, and we did hear from a reader who mentioned that her father was involved in the manufacturing process, and we were able to get in touch with her and sort of get some of her memories about this. I realized after our interview that the person who reached out was actually the daughter of Tonka Toys co-founder Al Tesh. So what you hear next is a mashup of my phone conversations with Tesh's daughter, Vanita Kronk, and her brother, Clint Tesh.
So I wound up being able to go to grade school, kindergarten through second grade at Mound. The school was right across the street from the factory. So I rode to work every day with Dad, and some days my days got really long. And I spent a lot of time actually in the factory. Dad made the dies for the toys. That's
okay.
What he did. And the one I know specifically about is the first dump truck. And I remember him telling me about this and talking about it. He was sitting doodling in his office one day trying to come up with the right plan. And he looked out the window and there was a dump truck somewhere. That was kind of his model for how he came up with the first dump truck.
And when he was making these dies, what was that process? Because he's shaping metal here, right? Or was he more designing it?
Yeah. The toys were die cast, like the hoods, the covers, the pieces, different pieces were cast using the die to make now that's something Kurt could tell you better than I can.
He was a good tool and die maker because he was a pretty important person during World War II working at Northern Pump and Honeywell. They started this right after the war, and you couldn't get steel. So a lot of people don't know, but all the original toys, they went to Detroit. At that time, when building cars, a door was punched out in one big thing. Mm-hmm. So there was big chunks punched out where the windows go. Well, that was scrapped. So those pieces they punched out as car window doors is what most original toys were made out of.
Wow. That's interesting.
My dad would often stay there 24 hours a day. So in kindergarten back in those days was all day. And then after school, I'd have to go over to the plant. And at first when we did that, I'd be wandering around, but then I got accused of bothering the help too much. So I'd have to sit in his office. And I can remember that office very clearly and just absolutely hated it. I'd have to sit there until my mom would bring supper over, and we would all eat supper there, and then we'd go home with her.
Thank you to Vanita and Clint for sharing those memories with us here on the podcast. All right, well, Nick, I just think this is such a fascinating topic. Did you sort of grow up hearing about Tonka trucks, Tonka toys? Is this a brand that you remember well? Or did you have one?
I don't remember. I'm sure I did at some point in my life, but I'm an 80s kid. And I think in this era, toys have come such a long way.
There's a lot of toys back then.
Yeah. Action figures, G.I. Joes, Hot Wheels.
Right.
Nintendo, video games were coming into play. So, Tonka you think they dominated the metal truck industry for 30 years, something like that?
Yeah.
And probably still dominating it. But other toys had come along by then.
Yeah.
And I think,
and I didn't have one, but I do know this brand, and I remember hearing
the brand name, though, yes.
And I don't know where, I must have seen it, maybe we're kids watching TV and you just remember things, like subconsciously. Maybe that was it.
But I think any kid that, even if you didn't have it at home, at school, or maybe your daycare, or some kid in the neighborhood, somebody had it.
Yeah.
It was somewhere.
Yeah. And when we were working on this, I just looked on Target to see, because I was like, they must be made of plastic now. And there is a lot of plastic involved in them, but they're still metal at their core. That's still the selling point of these things, which I think is kind of interesting.
Right. But the durability, that's why it's still around today.
Yeah. Well, Nick, thanks so much. This is such a fascinating history, and thanks for researching it for us.
Thanks for having me.
All right, that's it for today's show. Thanks, as always, to Matt Gilmer for editing this podcast. We will be taking a brief summer vacation for a couple weeks, but have a bunch of good shows in store for the coming months. Do you have feedback for us or a question you'd like to see us answer at Curious Minnesota? Send us a note at curious@startribune.com. And as always, if you are enjoying this show, please tell a friend about it. Thanks.
Thanks for listening to Curious Minnesota. We want to hear from you. Ask questions and read more stories online at startribune.com/curious. Our show is recorded at the Star Tribune's headquarters in beautiful downtown Minneapolis, and our music is produced by Matt Gilmer. If you like the show, please rate us on iTunes or leave a review. And until next time, stay curious.